In this video, I want to talk about fishing shallow water during the winter. If you have lakes or ponds that aren't completely frozen over during the winter, there are definitely always going to be some shallow water fish, but you kind of have to take a few things into consideration if you want to catch these fish. Now, before we get into the video, this one's brought to you by my apparel company, Finn Fishing. Right now is the month of December. I am running a ton of sales over on the website. My USA made sun shirts are on sale. The bass hats are on sale. The all new duck shorts are on sale. Most things are 20% off. A few things are actually 30% off. And everyone who buys in the month of December is going to be put into a drawing, no matter what you buy. And you're going to possibly win one of 4 different products or prizes. I'm basically giving out 2 one-of-a-kind bass hats. They're a color scheme that I've never done before. Like I said, one of a kind. One person is going to win a ARC Tharp Series grinder rod. This is the best crankbait rod that I've ever owned. I really, really like it. And the grand prize winner is going to win an ARC Gravity 7 reel. This is truly the best reel on the market. Like, of the ones that I've used, and I've used a ton, this is the best casting, best reel that I've ever used. And I really like it, but it could be yours if you buy something over at Finn Fishing. So I'm gonna leave some links down below in the description. Shopping at Finn is the best way to help support this channel. Thank you to all of you who have shopped there in the past. Also, thank you for simply watching the videos. All right, let's talk about shallow water fishing during the winter. And just so you guys know, I think that I'm going to step up at least for probably the next month or 2 to doing 2 videos a day, which to me sounds like a lot, but I did a video the other day of people basically asking people what they wanted to hear, and I promised the people that I would do a video on it, and I got a lot of comments. I got over 255, I think, comments on that video. So I'm going to be doing a lot of videos here soon, making sure that I can get through all of those comments. All right, but in this video, we're talking about shallow water fishing during the winter. Some of you guys don't have electronics and you want to fish shallow. Some of you do have electronics, but you still want to fish shallow. Some of you guys can only fish shallow water. So there are a few things that I want to talk about. Now, the first thing is what I put a little list together here. The first thing I put is afternoon. Okay, when you are fishing in the winter months and you're fishing in colder water primarily, the afternoon time frame to catch bass is typically going to be best. Now, if you have clearer water, I think that no matter what kind of water color you have, you're always going to have a little bit of a morning bite. But when it comes to specifically shallow water fishing, I think that you're going to have more fish in shallow water later in the afternoon kind of evening time frame than you will in the morning, because sometimes you're simply colder at night and you come out of that coldness, and I think that a lot of fish kind of shift down and then they'll move back up in the afternoon. And so I typically, if I'm gonna fish in colder water or winter and I'm fishing shallow, I like that afternoon bite the best. So think about that. Whether you're fishing lakes or ponds, try to plan your trips around fishing in the afternoon, because that is typically when you're going to have the warmest water of the day, which can really help you to get a few more bites. I mean, the difference between going from 43-degree water temps and 46 in a day can make a huge difference, or 50 and 52. It can really make a big difference. So concentrate on the afternoons. Now, I want to talk a little bit about fishing lakes, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about fishing smaller bodies of water like ponds, because they are a little bit different when it comes to shallow water fishing in the winter. Now, when it comes to lakes, I've talked about this a lot over the years, but the most important thing that you want, even if you are fishing shallow during the winter, is having some sort of deep water access close by. This is extremely important, because there's not going to be a population of bass that is going to be on these flatter areas during the winter. If you have cold water temps and you have a big giant flat that's 2-3 foot and you get to the back of it and it's a foot of water, like, bass don't typically like that type of area in the winter and in cold months. And it's simply because a bass in that situation would have to travel all that distance to get to 3 or 4 foot of water where it might feel more comfortable. But if a fish is on kind of a steeper bank, it literally only has to travel 2 foot to get where it wants. And a bass in cold water has a lower metabolism, so they just simply don't want to travel as far. So no matter what, if you are fishing in shallow water, I still want some sort of deep water access close by. Okay, and this is very relative to the body of water that you're fishing. Some lakes, this may be 20 and 30 foot of water. Some lakes, it may be 7 and 8 foot of water. But some sort of deep water access fairly close by can be extremely important. Okay, and so that's also why a lot of times in the winter, I'm going to concentrate on creek channel swings and main river channel swings. You know, anywhere you have a creek channel that hits up against the bank, that is a primary area where you can catch a lot of fish, even though they're going to be shallow. Again, they have that deep water access close by. A bluff in the winter can be a really good area to find fish. But a lot of times you will catch fish on bluffs in shallow water. You might be throwing a crankbait that only dives 6 foot deep. Or maybe you're throwing a jig up to the bank and you catch a fish on that first hop or two, but again, they are close to deep water. And this doesn't have to just be creek channel swings and river channel swings. Just last year, I was fishing a lake and I was fishing it in December, and I'd never been to this lake before. And I ended up catching fish in about 8 foot of water, which is relatively shallow to the body of water that I was fishing, in trees. I was flipping and pitching these cedar trees. But the thing is that there were cedar trees that were in 8 foot of water, but that were directly next to where it dropped off into like 30 foot of water. Those were the trees you had to be on. I found other trees throughout the day that were in 8 foot of water, but then they would be on these flats where it was like 8 foot for forever. And I never caught a fish in those zones. It had to be 8 foot of water trees where they dropped off into like that 10, 20, 30 foot of water. Not 10, 20 and 30 foot of water. So anyways, again, that's another situation where you want to have deep water access close by. So that, to me, when it comes to fishing a lake, is the most important thing that you can look at. The next thing that I want to talk about is keeping your lure selection simple in cold water. And in cold water, you know, during the summertime, I think that there is every lure that we own can be at play during the summer. You know, like the spring and the summer, you can catch fish on so many different lures. During the winter, your scope of lures that really works in colder water narrows, which is actually a good thing, because then you don't have to like think about so many different baits and where they can work in different situations. You know, I've actually recently done a couple of videos on cold water lures and why I like them. So I'm not gonna go into that like a lot, because you guys can just rewatch those videos. But I do wanna say that baits that are subtle, baits that don't make a lot of action, you know, Ned rigs, shaky heads, those type of baits, finesse swim baits, those type of baits that are smaller, that are subtle, that just don't have a lot of action, silent baits, those are the type of baits that you want to use a lot in the winter and in cold water and in shallow water. A bait that I throw a lot is some sort of crankbait. And I like those tight wiggling crankbaits. Again, I've talked about that, especially the balsa tight wiggling crankbaits can be really good. They can be difficult to cast at times. And that's why typically, like if I'm not using a balsa crankbait, I'll use like a Berkeley Fritz side, which is tight wiggling, but you can cast a little bit better with a bait caster. But when it comes to lures, just keep things simple. And no matter where I go in the country, no matter what time of the year it is, I always have the same type of like 4 lure system, is I guess what you would say, 4 lure approach. And I've talked about this a lot too, but basically I'm gonna have a lure that's fast, I'm gonna have a lure that's slow, I'm gonna have a finesse lure, I'm gonna have a big lure. Like that's what I do no matter what, even during the winter. Even during the winter, this still applies. So the thing about it is, though, a fast lure isn't going to be like a fast lure during the summer. You know, a fast lure during the summer may be a topwater bait, and that same topwater bait is probably not going to work during the middle of winter. But a fast bait, like I said, may be a flat-sided crankbait this time of the year. It could be a jerk bait. You know, really, these are a lot of times horizontal presentations. The next bait is going to be something slow. So this could be a lot of times a jig, can be a really small jig is what I like a lot during the winter and in cold water. Another good plastic bait, if I had to pick one slower moving plastic bait in the winter that's really good, that like you can fish on a bait caster, it would be a tube. A tube is a really good cold water bait. It doesn't have a lot of action to it, but fish just like that thing, man. And you can catch some really big ones. So a Texas rig tube, and then you have your finesse stuff. And we talked about this just the other day. I mean, Ned rigs, shaky heads are my go-to in cold water. And I'll fish them, I'll fish those baits kind of in a lot of the exact same areas. It just kind of depends on the cover that I'm fishing them around. And then something big. The only difference about something big in the summer or warm water months than in cold water months in the winter is that you want baits that don't have a ton of action. So if you think of like some of your big baits that work well in the winter months, these are baits like a Huddleston swim bait. A Huddleston was made famous basically by being a really good cold water big lure, because a Huddleston is big, but it has that different, it doesn't have really a boot style tail, it has more of a wedge style tail. And when you bring that thing through the water, the whole body, it's not moving tremendously. It's literally like everything is in a line except for the boot. And it's just, the boot's just going back and forth, or not the boot, the wedge is just going back and forth like this. It's very subtle action. So it's always good to have one of those baits with you. Like I've said, the reason that I like to finish with a big bait a lot of times in an area, if I think it's a good area, is because I want to make sure that I'm not there at the wrong time. Because sometimes you will find fish that follow those big baits and you realize that they're just not in a time frame to commit. And that's where maybe you can come back in the afternoon or hit it at a different time of the day where those fish are wanting to commit. So I still go fast, slow, finesse, big, but you have to do it a little bit differently according to the shallow water that you're fishing in the winter. All right, let's talk next about pond fishing. And this is actually something that I did a lot growing up, was fish in a little bit shallower water. I mean, most ponds out there are shallow. Like most ponds out there are probably less than 8 foot of water. So you're fishing primarily shallow when you are fishing a pond in the winter. And so I did this a ton growing up because I was super fortunate that there was a pond in my backyard, a 1 acre pond. And any time that thing wasn't frozen and the weather temp was above 32, I would usually get at least a couple of casts out there. And so a lot of the same lures are going to apply, like jerk baits and crankbaits can be done. It's a little bit different in a pond depending on what that pond is made out of. There's a lot of silt bottom ponds across the country that are a little bit more mucky, a little bit more difficult to fish a crankbait in that situation. That is where I would lean more on like a lipless crankbait or a jerk bait. But if you have ponds that have rocky terrain on them, still a crankbait can definitely be fished well. You're just going to kind of fish it in reverse. You know, in a lake, you're kind of casting shallow and bringing that bait deep. In a pond, you're kind of casting out deep and bringing that bait up, if that makes sense. So you're kind of doing everything in reverse, but it's similar to what you would do in a bigger lake, but you're just doing it in a pond. The other thing about a pond that is different is, like I said, almost everything is shallow, but it is important to still try to find the deepest part of that pond, because you will literally have bass that will winter in the deepest part of a pond. And I know this again because of the pond that I grew up on. There was a spot on this pond that was like 12 foot deep, so pretty deep for a pond. And I could cast baits out into that area, let them sink to the bottom, and I would catch fish in this one little area, this one little zone that I knew was the deepest part of the pond. Now, I knew that it was the deepest part of that pond because when I was young, I took a paddle boat and a piece of string with a rock on the end of it, and I dropped it down and measured the distance of the pond. What I did is I made a topographical map of my own pond because I was that bored during the summer when I was like 13 years old. But anyways, I knew the exact deepest part of this pond. Now, obviously, you're maybe not that crazy about your ponds that you fish, but what you can simply do is before you start fishing that pond in the winter, take 20 minutes and cast the jig out to certain areas in that pond and try to cover as much of it as possible, and just count how long it takes for that jig to hit the bottom. So obviously the ones that take longer to hit the bottom are going to be your deeper water areas, and that's now you kind of know of a zone that you might be able to concentrate on. Now, some ponds are the same depth no matter where you go in them. It's like they're literally a bowl shaped. So if they're bowl shaped, typically the very dead center of that pond is going to be your deepest part. But if they're also bowl shaped, or maybe they just come down on the sides and they flatten out, then again, you have to use a little bit of common sense here, but that just simply means that bass can be anywhere. If the whole depth of that pond is the exact same, then bass can be anywhere. So then what it comes down to typically is the best cover option, or the best little like, I don't want to say contour line, because you don't think of contours a lot in a pond, but if you have a really bowl-shaped pond, but there's a little bit of a subtle point in the bank, then that point is probably going to be where those bass are. But if you have some sort of piece of cover that is somewhere on that pond, maybe it's an old lay-down tree that sticks down into the pond, that's going to be a primary area for shallow water bass in the winter. Maybe you have a random grass clump out in the middle. So those are the type of things that you just have to think about when it comes to pond fishing. It's similar to lakes, but it's just a smaller scale, and you don't typically have lakes unless you're like down in Florida, or even some parts in the northern part of the country that are shaped like a pond. So ponds are just different in that way. So the other good thing though about a pond is they can warm up very quick in a day, especially shallow water ponds, which means if you have those random days in December, January, February, where it's like 60 degrees, like we all have them, those bass will get to the bank. And I've seen this before where I've been able to use like a swim jig and fish like pretty shallow water, and the bass will be in that shallow water. So anyways, guys, that is my video about shallow water shallow water wintertime. I don't even remember what this is called. Wintertime shallow water fishing. My goodness. All right, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you tomorrow.